Hey everybody, welcome to Midweek Sitrep, your weekly briefing on national security law and policy. My name is Jerry Fowler, and I'll be your host. Each week, I break down what you need to know and what you might have missed in the world of national security and business, all in under 20 minutes so you can stay mission focused. Today, we're going to be covering a major shift in U.S. investment policy. On February 21st, President Trump issued the America First investment policy that redefines how the U.S. manages foreign investments, both inbound and outbound. Ultimately, this policy affects corporate deal makers, compliance teams, and government regulators alike. So let's unpack what it says, what it does, and what it means for you. So let's talk about what the policy is and what it isn't. President Trump issued this policy through a national security presidential memorandum, which is one way the president can establish policy. It's the president's way of letting the public and his administration know what his goals are for investment and giving direction on how to achieve them. So by issuing the memorandum, the policy is established, but the measures in the policy are not yet implemented. Rather, the president is directing his departments and agencies to make these policy changes. So what's the policy? Essentially, it's America is opening the door to allied nations and shutting it on foreign adversaries. And this policy has three main parts. The first, encouraging investment from allied nations. The second, restricting investment from identified foreign adversary nations. And the third, restricting U.S. outbound investment in foreign adversary nations. Now that we know the three main parts of the America First investment policy, let's talk about it outside of policy language. Let's go through an example. So imagine the U.S. economy as an airport. And we all know that airports have screening. So for years, foreign investment was kind of like TSA screening, with most investors getting through and some extra screening for high-risk individuals. Now, under the new policy, that system's changed. So let's think about those three main categories, and let's assign them who they are at the airport. So your trusted traveler that gets a priority lane with faster approvals and fewer delays, think TSA PreCheck with Clear. Those are your allied nations. Now, those high-risk travelers that face increased security checks, more restrictions, and in many cases, outright denial of entry, those are going to be your China and other adversarial nations that are identified. Now, certain passengers that might be blocked from boarding certain flights, that's your outbound U.S. investors that are trying to invest in adversarial nations in certain technology areas. So hopefully that makes it a little bit clearer on what we're talking about with these three areas. So what does that mean for your business or compliance strategy? Well, let's take it from a CFIUS point of view, which CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. If you're seeking foreign investment, you want to make sure that your investors come from an allied nation to qualify for that fast-track CFIUS approval. If you're expanding operations overseas, you should be aware that U.S. outbound investment restrictions may limit your Chinese exposure. If you're advising clients on cross-border deals, you'll want to review how CFIUS oversight on greenfield investments could impact real estate and infrastructure projects. If you're in private equity or venture capital, you need to monitor how potential bans on investing in Chinese biotech, AI, and semiconductor firms could change portfolio strategies. Simply put, the rules of engagement have changed. The key to compliance is understanding how your specific industry is impacted. To really examine the type of change that this policy brings, let's discuss what the policy was previously. The Biden administration and even the first Trump administration negotiated with parties over CFIUS mitigation to allow Chinese investments with additional scrutiny rather than outright blocking them. Without turning this into a deep dive on the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS, the point of CFIUS is to conduct a case-by-case review of specific transactions to determine if the transaction presents a national security concern. If the committee identifies risk arising from that transaction, the committee informs the parties of their finding and whether the risk can be mitigated or if it's unacceptable. This usually leads to negotiations, and if the risk can be mitigated, the parties enter into a national security agreement or a mitigation agreement, subscribing to ongoing compliance measures and reporting requirements. This strategy was more about managing risk than shutting doors. Now, the America First investment policy turns that model on its head for investments coming from foreign adversary countries. In fact, President Trump said his administration will cease the use of, quote, overly bureaucratic, complex, and open-ended mitigation agreements for United States investments from foreign adversary countries. He goes on to offer his general thoughts on mitigation agreements, saying they should consist of concrete actions that companies can complete within a specific time frame, rather than perpetual and expensive compliance obligations. Now, this will have significant implications for business moving forward, but it also affects current mitigation agreements being monitored. According to CFIUS's annual report to Congress for calendar year 2023, at the end of 2023, CFIUS reported it was monitoring 246 mitigation agreements and conditions. Moving on from CFIUS, let's talk about the outbound investment controls. The original so-called reverse CFIUS is a first Trump term era concept. After years of rumor mill, President Biden issued an executive order establishing the Outbound Investment Security Program, which the final rules went into effect on January 2nd, 2025. Instead of sector and country agnostic CFIUS-style case-by-case reviews, the program sets up limited sector areas, targeted countries of concern, with categories for transactions that are prohibited and notifiable. Now, critics of the Outbound Investment Security Program have noted that it's drafted to easily expand the in-scope sectors and the countries of concern. And with the America First investment policy, it appears that's where we are headed. Biden's rules introduce targeted restrictions on U.S. investments in China's AI, semiconductors, and quantum computing industries. Trump's memo suggests expanding these restrictions to biotech, aerospace, and defense technologies, and potentially banning investment outright. There's also congressional interest in making outbound investment security permanent by codifying it. Currently, it's an executive order. This continues to be a developing area that requires businesses to stay informed. Ultimately, both the Trump administration and Biden administration implemented barriers to Chinese investment in the U.S. However, the current Trump administration is taking a stronger approach, which signals they may think the previous way was not that effective. What's that mean? Well, it's time to update the old playbook. U.S. investors and businesses may need to rethink their exposure to China more aggressively than they did under previous frameworks. So if you're like me, you're probably at this point thinking, what should I be watching for? And what are the takeaways here? And what is CFIUS going to look like? So for compliance teams and in-house lawyers, the biggest shift here is that CFIUS is no longer just a screening tool. It's a national security enforcement mechanism. And the things that I think you should watch for is CFIUS gaining authority over greenfield investments, meaning new businesses, land purchases, and infrastructure projects with foreign backing would be under scrutiny, not just acquisitions. I would also look out for stronger outbound investment rules that could potentially block funding for China-linked companies in AI, quantum computing, biotech, and semiconductors. To the extent that it's public, I would monitor financial penalties and forced divestitures because they could become more common for businesses violating investment bans. So, what should you be doing? What should you be thinking about here? I think some key takeaways for a legal and compliance team should be that your due diligence needs to be updated. You need to review whether your firm's investment partners, acquisition targets, or supply chain vendors have ties to these restricted nations. Contracts and deal structures, well, they may need to be adjusted. If outbound investment bans expand, partnership agreements with Chinese firms may need exit strategies or revised terms. You should be preparing for regulatory uncertainty. And I know if you're in this space, you already know that this is an uncertain area. New rules are coming, and it's expected that Congress and federal agencies are likely to act soon. This shouldn't be shocking to any legal or compliance professional. Since the Russian invasion, we've all been busy trying to stay on top of updates to sanctions, export controls, bulk data rules, and the outbound investment security program. This is a revival for national security compliance, and it is that much more important to stay on top of everything that's happening. So what's your job? Well, in addition to what your boss thinks your job is to stay ahead of these changes before they become enforcement actions. So we've talked about all of this uncertainty that's being unleashed on the investment climate. The big question now is, what is next? How aggressively will this policy be enforced? And what's it going to look like? I think three scenarios could play out. I think the first is a hardline approach. The administration enforces new restrictions aggressively, leading to forced divestitures and financial penalties, increased regulatory scrutiny. See, I think this is highly likely in certain circumstances. CFIUS doesn't need additional congressional authority to refer investigations to the president to block or divest. That policy could have and probably was implemented as soon as the memorandum was released. Now, the second scenario would be a selective enforcement scenario. Some restrictions are strictly enforced, while others are used as a bargaining chip in trade negotiations with China. Now, we've seen President Trump use tariffs as bargaining chips. Is it now investment's turn? I think the third would be legislative pushback. Congress may block or delay certain measures and water down enforcement. However, with the current congressional makeup, I'm not sure that this is a likely scenario. But what I do know is businesses should prepare as if the more stringent rules will be enforced. So here's some actions you could take. You can review investment and compliance policies and assess your potential exposure. You can closely monitor pending regulations on the outbound investment bans. You can engage with regulators and legal teams to stay ahead of enforcement trends. So what's the bottom line here? While it's not new that the U.S. is treating foreign investment like a national security issue, the stated policy signaling a coordinated strategy leading to strong enforcement is. If your business crosses borders, these changes aren't optional. They're essential. So I have a few thoughts here. While the policy represents a fundamental shift in how the U.S. approaches foreign investment, I don't think it's shocking or it came out of nowhere. Those in the space have seen CFIUS transform from a last resort stopgap measure to being a significant part of the mergers and acquisition process. Now, while the policy can lead to increased complexities for business and investors, these policy directives are in line with the president's statement that economic security is national security. So if this is a national security measure, then it's expected that the policy and protection efforts must adapt and address the current threat picture, not stay stagnant, and in the case of CFIUS, enter into national security agreements just for the sake of having an agreement. I think the policy signals that this administration is aimed at reducing the burden on business and increasing the effectiveness of protective efforts. So will it be successful? I don't know. Will it reduce the burden on businesses? Hopefully so. But one thing's for sure, if you operate in critical industries and technologies, you need to ensure you have a strong compliance framework. And if you don't, then maybe we should talk. Well, folks, that's it for today's Midweek Sitrep. If you found this helpful, make sure to subscribe, share, and stay engaged. I'm Jerry Fowler, and I'll see you next week. The information provided in this podcast is for general information purposes only and does not constitute legal, financial, or professional advice. Listeners should consult with a qualified professional before making any decision based on the content discussed. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the host and the guest and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any government agency, the U.S. military, or any employer, organization, or entity with which we are affiliated. Mention of a company, product, or service in this podcast does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation. Any references are for information purposes only. This podcast does not disclose any classified, proprietary, or confidential information. Discussions are based on publicly available information and personal expertise.